Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Pathfinder, a podcast by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. I'm your host, Mo Islam, and today we're joined by Dan Piemont, the co-founder, president, and CFO of ABL Space, a launch startup based out of El Segundo, California. ABL's launch model focuses on a containerized ground system that allows the company to launch from effectively any flat surface in the world. Now, after an anomaly in their maiden launch earlier this year, they're getting ready to get back to the pad. We go through what happened in Flight 1 and the upgrades to the new launch vehicle, but first, a quick word from our sponsors. SpiderOak's Orbit Secure software is designed for hybrid space operators struggling to manage the chaos of securing data flow and access to and from tens of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit. Using a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, Orbit Secure allows your mission to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure hybrid space environments. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. Dan, welcome to the show. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mo.
So we have a lot to talk about. So as we mentioned earlier, you're the co-founder, president, and CFO of ABL, launch startup out of El Segundo, California. You guys have done some pretty cool stuff so far, but before we jump into the new developments on the launch side, you obviously have Flight 2 coming up. CEO of the business and your co-founder, Harry O'Hanley, just published a very detailed, but very transparent blog post about Flight 1 learnings and journey to Flight 2, which we'll definitely talk about. But before we get into all of that, how did you get into the industry?
Yeah, well, Harry really recruited me into it. Harry and I were classmates together at MIT. We've been in touch since then, and I had studied physics as an undergrad, really focused on astronomy and cosmology. So I've always been interested in space, but my career was in business before this. So, starting out on Wall Street and then working for some VC firms, a few other startups, primarily focused on software, AI, machine learning. That was my background before I started ABL with Harry a little over 6 years ago now.
Well, give us a few minutes on that, the history of ABL, right? So Harry comes to you and says, "Hey, we're starting a rocket company," right? And you're like, "What are you talking about?" Or how did that initial conversation go?
Well, I knew exactly what he was talking about. I mean, Harry had worked at SpaceX for his whole career, back to as an intern while we were still students together at MIT. So I was fully aware of everything he had done there and how the industry was progressing. And we had talked about the industry structure, market structure, and what business opportunities might be present for a while. So it didn't come out of nowhere, but it was definitely exciting when we realized that it was a real opportunity and something that we were going to go and do.
And what made you believe that you guys had what it took to compete in what was a pretty I would say crowded industry?
Well, yeah, ultimately, you need to be confident in your ability to execute. We had a pretty detailed business plan that we fleshed out over the course of a few months. What can I say? It's still a very specialized thing. Not a lot of people have the experience required to do this. We knew we had access to those people, and we thought we had a differentiated plan compared to what we saw out in the market. And if I had to summarize that in kind of a single phrase, it would be, we thought there were a lot of projects that were taking up a lot of oxygen that had high risk, low reward technology approaches, meaning you're biting off this big 0-to-1 technology risk where it may not work. If it does work at the end of the day, you still have a launch system with very similar constraints, no special value, and in many cases higher cost than what you would have if you took a lower technology risk approach. So we sharpened our pencils on that and got really comfortable that it was going to be a good plan.
So I had the privilege of visiting your guys' factory, call it like 6 months ago or something. And my favorite story that you told there was about what ABL stands for. I don't know if you've talked about that publicly, but can you give us a little bit of color around the naming process?
We haven't discussed it publicly. It's something everybody loves to ask. It's taken on a life of its own. What I'd say is it's a celebration of a storied tradition in aerospace of opaque acronyms. There's a lot of good acronyms, though. In the UK, they say it stands for Another Bloody Launch Company. So that's the one that
Okay.
is the most.
All right, there you go. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the my earlier question. Just kind of how do you think about ABL's differentiating or key differentiation? Right. I know you have a unique methodology in terms of ground system and how you guys think about deployment and launch. But maybe talk a little bit about. I certainly don't want to put words in your mouth. Like what how do you view how do you kind of tell that story of ABL's key differentiation?
Yeah, so I'll explain a few things. The first one's architectural. I think it's the easiest thing to digest. And then there's some others that are more behind the scenes but are equally important. Architecturally, you've seen a lot of our messaging. We talk both about RS1 and GS0. So the launch vehicle and the ground systems, we've described it as a launch site in a box that we use to launch RS1. That whole system together is called GS0. We think those is equally important. And the key architectural point is that both the launch vehicle and the GS0 systems are packaged to fit into shipping containers. And what that enables is highly deployable type of operations. There's a couple advantages that come with that. One is you can accomplish unique missions, and they're really defense missions. When you think about what space access means to national defense, especially in the current environment with near peer or peer competition, space access is the ultimate high ground, and ensuring access to space to support your broader military efforts and those of your allies is existential. And I think of it as a strategic capability that should be held at the same level of need and assurance as the most strategic capabilities that we have. And when you think about what peer competition looks like, there are serious and real threats to our space systems, and there's a lot of unclassified information that describes that. There's also serious and real threats to our launch facilities. There's base incursions, cyber threats, and other types of sabotage that put big public facilities with thousands of people accessing them every day at risk. So when I think about base access, you need a strategic capability. It can't just be kind of this commercial model that operates from fixed launch sites. So there's a specific mission set that achieves. But that's not the most important element of our business. It's a small fraction of the total business that we've been awarded so far. It's a small fraction of the total future vision of the company, but it is something important and unique. There's a second element to that architecture that's beneficial, and it's purely commercial operational benefit. And what we found is that designing the systems and engineering them this way makes them much easier to manufacture, much easier to version control and process control and quality control. Easy to operate. We've operated at 3 separate propulsion test facilities over 3 years. In New Mexico, Edwards Air Force Base, and then a private site in Mojave. We also have 2 separate sites there. And we were able to transport systems from one to another. So it's reduced our total capital expense requirement. It's made it a lot easier to train our people and cross-train them between engine tests, flight tests, et cetera. And it's definitely given us a much leaner operational footprint in terms of costs. So those are the 2 sides of the benefit of the modular containerized deployable systems.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a ton of sense. I'm curious. Launch is of course heavily regulated in terms of where you can launch from, and obviously time of day and all that good stuff, right? Where is the regulation now to do what you are trying to do ultimately, right? Which is have these deployable ground systems to launch, versus where do you think it will go? Like, where is that today, versus where it will go? Let's just say you have RS1, it's fully functioning, high cadence. Does that mean now you could how does that process work?
Yeah. So just to be clear, right now when we launch with the exact same licensing requirements, exact same form of analysis, coordination, et cetera, as any other provider. Mm-hmm. It's just systems we use to do that can be transported and operated rapidly in a different scenario. So that's FAA license operations, commercial spaceflight regulatory regime. There is also a separate regime for DoD flight tests where the DoD can license space operations, missile testing, et cetera, outside of FAA authority. But we operate under the FAA authority. So the way to think about it, systems are designed to meet this separate mission intent. We don't rely on that type. We continue to use commercial licensing approaches for all of our entire current manifest. and everything that we have planned. But there's a unique value proposition that if we ever had an impetus, national security impetus to launch rapidly in a different way from a different type of location, you have the technological capability to do it if you're willing to take a different regulatory approach.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. So let's talk Flight 1. So you had your inaugural maiden launch, Flight 1. There was an anomaly in the vehicle shortly after liftoff. And then you guys just published a very, very detailed note around what you think happened and how to get back on the pad. So maybe let's just start with Flight 1. In your words, like what do you guys think went wrong, and what type of data were you able to gather?
Yep. So we gathered a lot of data, as you would imagine. What we knew basically immediately was that a harness had failed in the aft cavity, which led to a loss of power to the valves on the engines, and the engines turned off. That was pretty quick to determine, and we could pinpoint the location of that harness failure based on the sequence in which the devices, the different avionics devices shut off. Mm-hmm. And we went through a long, detailed review. I don't know, Mo, if you've gone through this type of workflow before, but there's a very broad fault tree. Some people call it a fishbone chart, where it's branching into lower and lower levels. You really make sure to run a comprehensive sweep where you review the data in every system, whether it looks nominal or not, to kind of confirm that and do a disposition of everything. And most of that, it was a very, very helpful process, really supportive of our conclusion. What we zeroed in on as the cause of the harness failure was a fire in the aft end, which resulted from the engine plumes recirculating prior to liftoff in the launch stool. So you can imagine an overly restricted environment on the engine plumes creates a back pressure with a very hot gas against the aft close of the plate. We exceeded the design condition of that heat shield and penetrated it and started a small fire there, which led to the harness failure. So that was what we concluded was the most likely root cause of the anomaly. And it's been a huge workflow for us this year to redesign that launch system to provide greater flow area by making it higher and wider. We also went through with a fine-tooth comb all the other systems. We continue to do that through all of our testing to spot other areas where we can make improvements too.
And I'm curious, and this is obviously coming from someone who's not an engineer. Why do you think this wasn't caught during like static fire or like full duration or longer duration tests? Because you'd think, right, assuming the same ground system, that something like this would potentially pop up.
Yeah, it's a great question, Mo. We did identify that this was a risk during static fire. We had done some short duration static fire testing in our Flight 1 campaign. And the decision we made was to accept that risk for flight. We did make some improvements to the heat shield after static fire based on what we saw there. And the risk posture we had was if we successfully ignite and we meet our liftoff criteria, we're willing to take that risk into flight based on our evaluation of the likelihood that it was going to cause, ultimately lead to a loss of mission, based on the damage we had seen, or based on the observations we had made in static fire. So, this is always a really important part of leading a launch company in this phase of development. As you head into these flight tests, there are tests. There's always going to be something you can convince yourself to stand down and take some time to mitigate or redesign before flight. And you have to run a careful balance between collecting data on the other systems that you do get from flight tests only, and ensuring maximum probability of success for any individual mission.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, a lot of things to say. One, it was your first launch, and no privately funded company has made it to orbit on their first try. So it is incredibly hard. And obviously the most important things is, what you do with that data and how well you collect that data, right? So there's no question. Now, it sounds like, there's now a new upgraded vehicle, Block 2, that's heading to the pad soon. What are sort of the key technical improvements on Block 2 that are being made or have been made as a result of the learnings from the Block 1 issues? Yep.
So one thing to clarify there, the upgrades to GS0 were really driven by the Flight 1 outcome and our identification of the exhaust gas flow area as the most likely root cause of that fire. That's all the GS0 stuff. The RS1 upgrades were planned upgrades that were planned to roll in to the program around Flight 3 or Flight 4. So we had already built a serial number 2 of Block 1, which is identical configuration to what flew in January. The plan was to fly a few of those before we moved on to Block 2. And then because the Flight 1 outcome grounded the program for what will end up being 9 or 12 months, those Block 1 flights were demanifest. We're moving forward with Block 2. So these are already planned upgrades unrelated to Flight 1 and what we learned through that. Having said that, to actually answer your question, the upgrades there are pretty significant across the board on stage 1. So we've increased the thrust of stage 1 by 20% by adding 2 additional engines to the center area of stage 1. And that was a planned upgrade. Flight 1, you may have noticed, because you've got a good eye for this type of stuff, we had 9 engines around the radius of stage 1, but nothing in the middle. So that location was planned for upgrading thrust as we fine-tune the vehicle performance after we completed the first round of design iteration. We also increased the propellant mass by 20% just by elongating the stage a little bit. There's a lot of your typical stuff, lightweighting the tanks now that we have a better sense of the design loads that we need to design to. Stage system stuff. We've brought more componentry in-house. So there's a bunch of kind of typical block upgrade type work there. And then the other major changes, the first is that we've switched from a welded on engine bay to a detachable bolted on engine bay. And this has huge benefits for manufacturability, operability, overall design, quality, because you have much better access during assembly. Stage 1 of Block 1, you could only access through that center port and a couple little doors during assembly. Block 2, since it's detachable, you have access from both sides, top, bottom, multiple doors. So it's a lot more easy to parallelize work. And then the second major change is we've totally repackaged the individual engine packaging of the E2 engine. So it's a lot more compact. It has some great features, including that the aft closeout plate is integral to the engine when it's assembled. So that plate moves around. It's a really good handling device for the thing as you bring it through integration, bring it up to Mojave for tests, bring it back to the factory, get through checkouts, integrate it to the rocket. It's basically, it's a major design iteration that takes a lot of work, and the benefit is effectively in assembly and test. So we're set up well to produce those fast, test them fast. They're much more line replaceable. So if we identify an issue during data review with one of the engines on the stage, it's a very fast, few hours operation to drop that engine and swap in a replacement. These are all big changes from Block 1 that we think are major benefits to the program.
So what was the primary decision, the sort of the driving force behind going straight to Block 2? Because when you make such, you've made a significant number of improvements, right? Which is obviously great because you bring in sort of the timeline for when you were going to originally do this, but it does create more risk, right? There's now other things that maybe you guys hadn't tested nearly as much as you did with Block 1. How do you think about sort of weighing the pros and cons of like going straight to Block 2, but then adding risk to the vehicle?
Yeah, not really. The changes we made are generally strictly beneficial from a risk perspective, and the data that we got from Flight 1 that was really helpful. It's the startup at the stage level of 9 engines rather than individual engine startup, which obviously we have a lot of heritage with. It's the simultaneous bootstrap of those engines, getting up to full power. Then there's the stuff that you can only really test in flight, which is the hold down release, which we haven't changed that architecture at all. The physical connection and the fluidic systems between RS1 and GS0 are unchanged for Block 2. That was proven. We still have that heritage. And then GNC and avionics, free flying for the first time is a big test. We obviously have a lot of hardware in the loop testing, Iron Bird stuff. We have software-based simulation. But until you let it go, you haven't really verified your end-to-end polarity and all that. Outside of a simulation environment, with your exact mechanical kinematic response of your thrust vector controllers, your little TVCAs, your actuators, any deflections or vibration that could happen that couples with your control system. So that, it was only 10 seconds of flight for us, but all that was proven, and that heritage carries forward into the new system.
Right. Okay.
So yeah, we feel good about that. And then the rationale for carrying over to Block 2 for Flight 2 is really just time-based. We had planned to fly Block 2 at the end of this year anyways. We had just planned a couple Block 1 flights in the interim. So it allows us to catch up on the manifest. Block 2 is the vehicle that the customer put the manifest on. So it helps us recover schedule to cut straight over instead of keeping the 2 extra Block 1 flights on the manifest.
No, that makes sense. So is this a test payload, or will it be a commercial customer on Flight 2?
This is a test payload. Yeah.
Okay. And what is the plan for after Flight 2? And you guys haven't talked about yet when you're planning the launch, right? Is it planned to be this year, or have you not talked about that yet?
We haven't announced a date yet. It's going to be right around year end. Okay. We'll see exactly where it falls. We had this big milestone that you read Harry's remarks about called dock dress, where we really shut down the flight vehicle and the flight ground systems. Those are all shipping to Alaska now. So we'll see how activation goes. And once we have a clear line of sight to static fires, probably when we'll set the date for that test as well as flight.
Got it. And then assuming success on Flight 2, how are you guys thinking about cadence then going forward, right? Because the thing that investors always want to see is what's it? How long are you going to? It's great. Okay, so there's Flight 1, and there's Flight 2, and then there's always usually a pretty long time period between Flight 1 and Flight 2. But then everyone's like, "Great, when is Flight 3 going to be? Is it going to be right soon after? Is it a year later?" The cadence starts to become important as you start to now achieve success on the R&D side.
Yeah. So. The answer here is certainly path dependent, and that's important to keep in mind. You told me to assume success on flight 2, so I'll assume that we have a fully successful Flight 2. Yep. We've learned to be a little bit cautious with the planned schedule for return to flight. The data is so valuable. You do want to plan in a way that allows you to digest that data, get as much value out of it as possible, incorporate any learnings into your Flight 3 design as necessary, but also just make sure that you put appropriate bandwidth on it to get those lessons learned for whatever design upgrades happening at that time, whether it's for Flight 3, 4, 6, 10 plus. So, we don't want to set too aggressive an expectation there in terms of return to flight until we succeed. But I'd like to think that, a few months' time, in the case of a successful flight, is the amount of time that you need to get back to the pad. Now, having said that, separate from how fast we get to Flight 3, an important question is how are we setting up to produce at scale? What are our target production and flight rates going forward with the design and infrastructure we have now? That's something we track really closely. And the target we set that we try to measure ourselves against is a monthly production rate. So we want to understand through each of our systems, whether it's engine piece parts, engine assemblies, engine test, stage 1 tanks, stage 2 tanks, fairings, adapters, for each avionics, for each subsystem, what's our current constraint in terms of production rate? And that includes both building it and then testing it and accepting it for flight. And for a lot of those systems, we've already proven close to, if not beyond, a monthly production rate. Primarily in structures, our tank assembly line is pretty dialed in. It's the thing we've been doing for the longest. We can produce tanks at a monthly rate now with our existing infrastructure. Engine test also, we've gotten quite good at. We can ATP a flight set of engines, assuming no issues with the engines that are discovered during test in under a month. Every other day, getting an engine accepted. So we try to measure ourselves against a monthly production rate right now, but I don't expect, and we don't target to hit that flight rate immediately as soon as we have a success. We're going to try to be set up to produce at a rapid rate, probably produce at a rapid rate. We've already produced 40 flight engines for what it's worth of E2. So we're already producing certain subsystems at a rate that you can hold in inventory, and then you have flight rate, maybe quarterly to start, and then try to scale it up from there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Let's talk just traction real quick, commercial traction, both on the government and the commercial side. Maybe talk about where that stands right now and how that's going.
Yeah, so we have a great manifest for RS1. Over 70 launches sold to a handful of commercial customers, as well as 10 separate DoD contracts from 5 different DoD and IC agencies as well. We have one NASA contract also. So pretty broad-based. It's about 50-50 between U.S. government and commercial in terms of the end use. We also have a contract from the UK Space Agency to conduct a launch from the Shetland Islands. So yeah, civil, defense, intelligence, and commercial, all important for us. The listed price for RS1 is $12 million. So, terms vary based on the complexity of the mission, but you can map that to a backlog amount. I think it's one of the stronger backlogs in the industry, for our direct competitors. And one thing we've done is really just try to focus on real programs and high quality customers. One of the things that I have found can be a challenge in the launch business is if you load up your manifest with missions that aren't super likely to fly or anywhere near their target schedule, it could become really hard to plan your business around. So we've kind of built the manifest around Lockheed, DoD, NASA, Amazon, a couple other commercial customers, and our international partners in the UK.
And the one thing I've certainly noticed is if you look at most of your competitors, everyone effectively has gone out and announced what most are calling medium-sized launch vehicles, right? Call it 8, 10, 15,000, 20,000 kilograms to LEO type vehicles, usually significant upgrades to their kind of initial small launch vehicle. Is something like that in the works for ABL? Like, how do you guys think about medium and heavy launch?
Yeah, so we have said before that is our plan, and we have fairly mature plans to continue to upgrade the performance of the vehicle by a significant amount. We haven't shared that yet. We like to keep our eyes on the immediate task at hand, which is get RS1 flying at a sustainable rate. We do have a big manifest for it that we will serve, and it has a very important use, and it's core to our long-term business plan to have RS1 in its current form flying at a very high rate. So yeah, but we do have plans. I think if you had to stack rank business opportunities available to a small launch company that's operational, probably number one next best opportunity is make a higher performance launch vehicle. So it would be, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't have a plan in that area.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, let's take a quick break. And then when we get back, I do want to talk more about some of the supply-demand dynamics we're seeing in launch. So stay with us.
Yeah, sure.
Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. To quote the commander of the U.S. Space Force's Operations Command, cyber threats are unfortunately the soft underbelly of our global space networks. SpiderOak, the leader in space cybersecurity software, is dedicated to providing space operators with the solutions they need to protect hybrid space systems. Their Orbit Secure software uses a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, allowing missions to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure LEO and hybrid space systems. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. All right, Dan, I want to talk about supply-demand dynamics that you're seeing in the market for launch, especially like just segmenting between supply, kind of small, medium, and heavy, and demand, which is coming from constellations, rideshare, small sats, a lot of different customer segments. But curious, and you mentioned earlier 70 of your RS1s, you're manifested or you have signed 70 RS1s, if I heard you correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, 70. That's a big number. So what are you seeing in the launch market right now? There's one category of folks who are saying, well, oh, there's so many launch startups, there's so much supply and not enough demand. But clearly that's not what the market seems to be like displaying right now, at least in terms of like some of the things that we've heard from talking to operators.
Yeah, I think it's a misconception. I understand why it's there, and maybe it's a separate topic in terms of is launch crowded or not, as a macro point. But in terms of the specific supply and demand balance, one of the things you have to do as an analyst is break up the market into different segments, and those segments actually vary quite a bit. RS1. I guess I didn't even say it yet, but RS1 is a 1-ton class launch vehicle. And that is a small sat launch vehicle or a small launch vehicle. And it's easy to kind of group it in with other vehicles that are flying or have been announced or planned in that category. But it's a completely different market from a 100 or 200 or 300 kilogram class vehicle. We don't have missions that are CubeSats, either individual CubeSats or a group of 3 or 4 CubeSats. That's not our market. We don't contract those. We frequently no bid them because we're not competitive. What our market is all about are small constellations of, call it 6+ multi-100 kilogram spacecraft. Individual satellites that weigh 1,000 pounds. We have a significant number of missions in planning where it's a single satellite that's 500 or 600 or 700 kilograms. Which is a completely unique market. They can't fly on Rideshare. They're too big and chunky for that. They don't fit on smaller launch vehicles. It's a completely unique and distinct market, actually. And then if you look a little bit above that, small sats in GEO, for example. Small sats in GEO require a launch vehicle with a Lear performance of a couple tons, maybe 3 or 4 tons. They're not a great fit for our class, certainly not for the smaller classes. They're also not a great fit for larger launch vehicles because there's not good rideshare opportunities to GEO. And that's a big market because it's a big part of the emerging telecom architecture. It's also a really important area for national defense. So there's all these separate market segments, and the analysis of that can get lost in the mix because the biggest, most obvious projects are these giant constellations, which truly only care. They're going to LEO. They're happy to launch 80 at a time, 40 at a time, 20 at a time, 10 at a time. Any of that's all good as long as you get to orbit for a reasonable average price. So yeah, I'd say there's specialized market segments which are really important and valuable. It's also where you can command the most premium for missions because those are the missions that have the least options available to them. And then there are these giant constellations, both from commercial customers and also from the government, which are kind of price-focused, solution-insensitive customers.
Let's talk about rideshare economics, right? Rideshare, conceptually is not a new thing, but you do have a competitor that aggressively goes out and schedules rideshare missions, and there's a lot of questions over whether that's actually economical or not, and whether it's being done strategically. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but if you have, would love to hear them.
Low-cost rideshare has been an incredible boon to our industry. And there are so many programs that have proven their prototypes, proven basic capabilities to get ready for production using low-cost space access through rideshare missions. And that's very, very positive for everybody involved in the space market. So if there's anything about rideshare that's perceived as negative for other or smaller launch programs, I think it's misplaced concern. It's really been a benefit and helped a lot of small sat launch customers get their businesses off the ground. So first thing I'll say is this is clearly and strictly good, I'd say, for all players in the space business. Having said that, when I look at the business model, I don't think it's a compelling one. And the reasons why are around packing efficiency and utilization of the large launch vehicles when you fly them in a rideshare configuration. And it's a little difficult to describe without an image, but if you pull up an image of one of the famous, 50, 60, 70 plus satellite rideshare missions, what you'll notice is that they actually do consume a good fraction of the volume of the fairing as an integrated stack, but the percent of that's actually usable spacecraft is quite low. And they also typically have very heavy dispensers because the dispensers aren't engineered to be tailored to the specific spacecraft that are integrated to them. So they're over-designed and kind of modularized, which isn't great for that type of beam structure, especially when there are imbalances. So when I look at those missions, what I see is very capable launch vehicles with multiple tons of capacity dedicated to simply to unusable mounting structures. Yeah. And then fairly low fraction of the volume and lift capability that's actually allocated to operational satellites. And I think it's a very low fraction, and that's actually constrained on the upper limit by geometry, and that will only be worse for larger launch vehicles. If you think about how you pack thousands of small satellites into a giant payload volume, doesn't really work. You can only have a layer around the exterior side, or you need some type of crazy vending machine structure. So I think that the basic constraints of rideshare as an economic model aren't well understood. And if you look at the current market pricing and apply it to a reasonable guess at how much actually usable satellite mass is on here, the revenue I don't think makes a ton of sense either compared to the cost structure of doing these things. So, maybe you're making a little bit of money, but certainly not compared to whatever the other opportunities are from my perspective. So I don't think it's an attractive business for us to go into. I don't think it's a particularly appealing model in general for the space industry. After the point where you have launch vehicles of different sizes that are available.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So really, effectively, what you're saying is because of the mass and volume of the inside of a fairing, and then you take into account how the satellites themselves are integrated and put into various adapters. The reality is, a 300 kilogram or a 500 kilogram spacecraft might actually take up the room of something that could easily fit 1,000 to 2,000, and that's just lost mass, and that you're not actually sending up to space, and lost mass equals lost revenue. So that's what the. Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. So then begs the question, why does that model exist?
I can't, we don't operate that model, so I can't speak to the.
Okay, there you go. I think we'll let the listeners read between the lines.
There's one other thing I think is interesting to talk about with Rideshare, if I can do a couple more minutes on that.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So one of the premises of rideshare as an architecture for the space industry, which I think is also not super well understood, is the idea of using orbital maneuvering vehicles to take a consolidated deployment of many spacecraft to one orbit and then spread them out to their actual operational orbits. And this has happened through rideshare in the past, but not really for operational constellations in the way that it's been proposed, in the sense that you're going to launch 12 satellites with 4 different maneuvering vehicles and spread them out into a constellation mesh. And the reason why that I think people don't understand super well is that changing your inclination is an incredibly expensive thing to do in terms of delta V, or energy use. So if you look at the maneuvering vehicles that are out there that can move a satellite from a rideshare inclination to something a little bit different, the maximum you're going to get is maybe 10 degrees of inclination change, usually more like 5. So you're not really accessing a very broad range of orbits from that rideshare location. And at the same time, you've consumed a whole other satellite. The OMV has its own cost of a couple $1 million on top of the $1 million or $2 million that you're spending for your own satellite's launch mass, plus you need to pay for the launch mass for the OMV. So if you try to take that approach, you've actually multiplied the cost of your mission by 4 or 5, and that's not just artificial market-based cost increase. You're actually using a lot more equipment and capability to get where you need to go. So I think dedicated launches to the end destination are actually much more compelling and a much more fundamentally reasonable way to solve that problem. My argument there doesn't apply to altitude changes. Altitude changes are super cheap. So if you're going up and down, if you're phasing around on a orbital plane, that's all really cheap. And I think problems that are very well solved through that type of architecture. But if you're changing your inclination, it's really not an appealing architecture. And then if you're changing your RAN, which is this other important orbital parameter people pay less attention to, which allows you to actually spread out into a mesh network, even for a constellation that's all at a single inclination, that's just as expensive as changing inclination. So for constellation deployment, I don't think rideshare is really feasible.
Okay, so just to kind of simplify what you're saying here is effectively like, you have the concept of rideshare is let's put a lot of satellites together, send them to one space and one place, and let's help lower the cost that way, right? Makes a ton of sense. But the issue is if you get to that desired orbit and you have to change your inclination or your RAN, the added cost makes it such that doing a dedicated launch via small sat might actually end up being cheaper. That's effectively what I'm hearing, right, to a degree.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then so then my sort of natural next question, I think this is interesting. It makes a lot of sense. My natural next question is how many of do you know how many of those orbital maneuver type customers is altitude versus or inclination changes, right? Do you happen to know if there's more of one or the other, or when it comes to constellations, mostly it's inclination changes?
Yeah, so the way I would answer that is the advantage of altitude change for that architecture is it's easy, but it's also a disadvantage from a business perspective because most satellites can do it with their own thrusters. So what a lot of satellites do is they get deployed to a lower orbit, they do basic checkouts, and then they'll do their own orbit raise or phasing maneuvers. Another interesting comment that may be interesting for your listeners, we're going to get all your geekiest listeners excited here, Mo.
That's great. I love that.
The sun synchronous orbit as an inclination that you would target has a unique property in that most satellites that are flying to sun synchronous orbit want the exact same RAN because it determines what time of day you're over a specific place on land. That's why it's described as a sun synchronous orbit. So for that specific inclination, which is a decent chunk of the market, right now it's most of the rideshare market, there happens to be an artificially low diversity in how many different RANs people want to go to. Whereas for other inclinations, like mid-inclinations, most of the missions that are constellation missions are equally spread out over the full 360 degree of RAN. So another way to think about it is the rideshare market that exists now has basically grabbed the low-hanging fruit where most satellites actually do want to be at the same RAN. So the only variables that matter are inclination and altitude. But most aren't that way.
So going back to my original point I made earlier about launch being crowded, or I should say a common thing that people say, right, is that launch is crowded. The reality is there's not currently in the market outside of Rocket Lab's 300 kilogram Electron. There's not a launch vehicle that's operating at a high cadence and making that market seem viable for customers to be able to go and ask for things like, well, we want to be in sun synchronous at the same RAN versus orbit. There's all these things that I think sound like they're nice to haves, but they're not really being pursued in any meaningful way because there's not a viable, vehicle with history yet, right? Is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that's right. The only counterpoint I would make is that those of us who are not yet operating at a high cadence who plan to, we all have big books of business, right? It's not that there's proposed launch vehicles out there.
True.
Don't have contracts. So the missions do exist. They're in planning and execution, both at ABL and the other smaller launch vehicles. And I think, for folks who see the manifest and look at the books, it kind of all adds up. There's a real market there. It's on contract. It's in planning and execution, and the economics make sense. So it's not something that's being built and, then at some point you hit a high cadence and then you find out if there's a market there. We know there's a market there.
Yeah, no, for sure. That makes sense. So I want to switch gears for a second, talk about investors. So there's no question, there's no really a lot of debate right now that it's just a tough market to fundraise in general. Like, forget about space, just any technology company that's trying to raise big dollars. It's just much harder. It's taking a lot longer. How do you think about the current fundraising market, and what do you think investors want to see from launch companies? Like, what are sort of common pushbacks that you've heard or that you're seeing, and what are investors really looking for?
Yeah, so what investors look for in a launch company, I think it's getting a lot more mature. There's even in the past 5-6 years, there's an initial wave of investment into launch, just purely based on the success of SpaceX and incredible gains that early investors in SpaceX were able to achieve on that investment, and a lack of understanding of exactly what the risks are that make it difficult to build a successful launch business. Now I think there's a much better understanding, and there's a few things. I'd really highlight three. Number one, you need to clearly be able to do the job technically. I think underwriting the tech risk is a big hurdle for a lot of folks. And there's very few people who manage institutional capital who are going to be comfortable doing that themselves. So they're going to look for proxies, whether those are third parties that they rely upon, or as the fundraising company, your customers, being able to shed light on their understanding of your technology risk and execution. The technology risk is number one. They need to know that you can get it done. Number two, and this is equally important, is if you get it done, do you have something valuable? And this is something that I think in early waves of investment into launch was just taken as a kind of truism. If you have an orbital launch vehicle, it's a really valuable thing to have. But what we found is that if it doesn't have big enough manifest in the right market segment that can get to a scale you need for profitability, A, and B, have a cost structure that works, meaning the unit economics makes sense and it doesn't take 3,000 people to hit your target cadence. If you can't check both of those boxes, you still have a problem, even if you have a successful orbital system. So good economics is really important. And one thing that I've learned through this process about launch is we are not constrained on gross margin. It's not difficult at prevailing market prices, even though they've been dropping, to build a launch vehicle that costs a lot less to build and fly than people pay for it. What's difficult is achieving profitability in your operating margin, meaning after you cover the cost of all your infrastructure and all your people, are you still making money at a reasonable flight rate? The worst thing you could do is set up a company where you could be flying every week and you're still not making money. That's not an easy thing to invest in, because the risks you have to overcome to get even to that point are so significant. So yeah, as an aside, we have spent a lot of time in our development verticalizing our supply chains and really trying to wring costs out in the appropriate places from our system so we can achieve profitability at a relatively low flight rate. I think right now that's table stakes if you want to fundraise as a launch company from
yeah. I want to talk for a second, going back to Flight 1, what the sort of dynamic at the company was, after Flight 1, right? Obviously, it's never a good thing, and it's never, despite knowing that the odds are stacked against you, right? Every single time you're about to you're trying to put a vehicle into orbit, it's your first time doing it, the odds are definitely stacked against you. Yet despite that, it's always a bummer. I don't even know what it could feel like, working on a vehicle like that for, quite a long time, and then seeing, what happened. What was sort of the feeling internally? And then how did you guys get everyone hyped? How did you create that momentum in, heading into Flight 2?
Yeah, you're right on the money, Mo. You're 100% right. It was an incredible experience for us, for our group. And one thing about the way we set up ABL and the way we built it is that we are very oriented towards launch. We're all about the action. We really try to frame all of our work around get to the pad and fly. So to be in a position where, despite having that posture and disposition as a company, we kind of did all the math and deductive logic, said, hey, we're going to need to wait for block 2 here, and it may be 9+ months before we get to go again. That's a discouraging thing to experience, but people are hyped because what we're doing is something very few people have had an opportunity to do. You are in this industry on the media side. We're in it as an operating company. One of the things I think gets lost on folks in the industry sometimes is what we're doing is absolutely incredible, and you're at the avant-garde of something that's going to be really important for the next centuries. And it's a very, very rare opportunity to go and do that. So, in terms of the feeling, certainly an opportunity to take the result and lick your wounds. I think a lot of people were proud at how we executed the campaign and the diligence that went into it, and also the disposition. We like to be open about what our process is to get where we're going and what the results are. One thing that happens a lot in space flight is you try to kind of reframe flight testing failures as successful or something like that. We do not do that. We kind of take our lumps and learn the lessons we can and try to improve ourselves.
Will we have the pleasure of watching Flight 2 on a live stream?
No.
That's a bummer, but there's going to be plenty of people, I'm sure, watching from afar.
People won't stop asking, I'm sure about that.
People, yeah, exactly. Well, Dan, it was a pleasure having you. Thanks for being on the show. Very cool what you're doing. Obviously, very cool to see you build this company in the middle of LA, and very excited to see the next launch. So certainly good luck to you, and let's get you back after Flight 2. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.
That sounds good, Mo. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Take care.